All right, welcome everyone to How to Make Remote Work Awesome for Everyone. We're part of the Agile Everything Sydney group and Elaborate Lunch and Learn Melbourne group on the call today. And we're recording this for the Agile 20 Reflect Festival, which is happening globally throughout the world here in February 2021. So if you don't know what Agile 20 Reflect Festival is all about, it's a community-run global event with more than 800 events in many languages, all about Agile. Agile Manifesto celebrates 20 years this month. And so this is a community-run event. And John, if you go to the next slide, here's how you can get involved. You can go check out the website. It is all community and volunteer run, so they do have a GoFundMe page if you wish to contribute. They also have a code of conduct, so please treat others the same way that you want to be treated in these sessions. And these are being recorded right now, and you can watch these back on YouTube. They have a YouTube channel where they're recording every single event. So we might drop down the link in the chat to that event sometime throughout this today's presentation. So go check that out, and you can rewatch this as well. Awesome. So helping me out today, David Berry, your Master of Ceremonies, will be John Tooth, the Keeper of Time. Say hi, John. All right, I think we're ready to get started. Let's go for it. Next slide, John. All right, so how to make remote work awesome for everyone. We've got three presenters today. I'm going to introduce the first, James McMenamin. He's from the Australian Capital Territory. He loves to talk about politics and the difference between Australia and New Zealand. He's a lead consultant from Elaborate, but he's been using lots of fancy tools with remote agility framework lately. He's got the jacket on, so take it away, James.
Thanks, Dave. I do love to talk about politics and arguing about the difference between New Zealand and Australia. Those things are really important. The main difference is us Kiwis are better at rugby, and I'll leave it at that. So what we're here to talk about today is really how we've tried and experimented with remote work over the last year, and some of the things that we've come up with that can help with those processes. So I'm going to talk first about helping teams work really well together, and then Dave's going to talk about helping groups of teams do all hands planning and work really well together, and then Farnaz is going to talk about the more broad organisation and how you want to look at an organisation in a remote context, and you might think about the organisation model overall. So we're slowly increasing in scale. I can kind of handle a few people at a time, but then it gets really, really fascinating and interesting as I hand over to my co-hosts. So the conversation for me, I'm going to try to keep reasonably brief today. And I need to apologise in advance because I'm on parenting duties this morning. So after I finish yabbering, I'm going to run away and do the school run and so forth. So if you do have any questions for me, or you'd like to talk more about the things that I am about to talk about now, please feel free to reach out. My co-host can help you get in touch, or just grab me through the usual channels. So James McMenamin, you can find me on most of the socials and so forth. I think with that, we're probably ready to get into it. So next slide, please, John. So yeah, as I say, I'm going to talk about how we make remote teams work. Right. So there's a whole bunch of reasons for remote teams. Clearly, COVID has brought this into stark relief. We've all had to go remote, ready or not. I'm working at the moment with a number of teams that are remote, despite the fact that in Australia, generally, we've been pretty lucky. We still have teams that I'm working with who are Canberra, Brisbane, Melbourne based, and so forth. So there's a little bit of time zone difference in those things, but there's a there's a heck of a large geographical difference while they're all still in the same country. So I'm going to talk about some of my experience working with those teams when they were remote and working at home, and now that they are remote, but often working in a variety of offices. Thanks, John. So remote agility framework, we've been working to come up with a number of tools and patterns that can help us with remote working. This is the first of those tools. It's a remote team launch canvas. So this is a pretty simple canvas. It works really well in something like Miro or Mural, where you can have that kind of infinite whiteboard capability. But it can also work really well in less sophisticated tools. I've been doing a lot of work recently using Microsoft Teams and PowerPoint. So people are sharing the PowerPoint deck within Teams to work on these. And when I've been doing that, I've been cutting these canvases into screenshots that I'll use one screenshot for one section in a PowerPoint at a time. And so this is the simple version of the canvas. We think about our systems of work. What's the work that's coming in? How do we handle it? We think about who are our people, our team, our remote team, and how will we work together? Sorry, was there a question? Okay. And we also need to think about, well, how are we going to work together? How are we going to communicate? And what rhythms are we going to adhere to? And it can get a lot bigger than that. So on the next slide, I want to show you it's kind of the complexity that we get to, where we've created patterns for most of these items, where you can see we have exercises and patterns that we've created that really help us to have those conversations with our teams. So in that canvas up the top, you see a lot more color and so on. And that's because we've gone to a lot of work to make each of those areas really fit for having the conversation that we think is most healthy and most useful for the team. And down the bottom, we try to take all of the data that we've gathered from the top and coalesce it into something that's really simple for the team. And that hexagon at the bottom is what we would then call our remote team agreement. And that's what you would keep coming back to and say, hey, there's some things here that we need to remember and remind ourselves of. So on the next slide, I'll get into some of the detail of those three sections. The remote team alliance, that's the middle part. And that's what I want to talk about first. So this is what you might think of as your social contract, but really sometimes your traditional social contract would just be the part at the bottom. Hey, how are we going to behave together? What are our values? Those kind of things. But we also need to think, first of all, about our team name, our purpose. And John, if you hit go a couple of times, we need to think about situational empathy. Now we're calling that situational empathy really deliberately. We need to be thinking not just to have empathy with each other and all of those things that we traditionally need to do to have a high performing team and psychological safety. We also need to realize that when working from home, everyone's situation is really different. And there's a whole lot more that comes into play just to understand, well, what's your situation today? Like, for instance, there's every chance you're going to meet my little girl in a minute because I'm working from home and she's here too, and she might pop up and you'll see her face here, or you might not. Depends how lucky you are. But so we need to understand that some people have got kids in the house. We need to understand that some people have got home offices and they're working better now than they ever have before. And we need to understand that other people there's three of them in the same office and they're all sitting next to each other. And if they just have a quick team meeting, then they're hearing echoes of each other all the time, whatever it might be. We need to just understand that situation. The story that I have there that I'll tell very briefly is that we had a team launch a while ago where there was a guy who said, look, I'm sitting at home. We said, what's your situation? He said, I'm sitting at home. You guys are talking about having cameras on so we can engage, but look, I've got cancer. I'm going through chemo. I don't want to have my camera on. And so we had a chat about it. And we said, well, how can we make sure that we're engaged? And how can we make sure that we're looking after you? Because you're clearly having a really hard time. And by the end of that conversation, he said he felt more at home in this team that he'd joined 2 days ago than he had in his last team that he'd been part of for 2 years, because his last team were just too polite to talk about his situation. They weren't a mean or bad team. They just wanted to let him alone and respect his privacy. But what he wanted to do was be able to talk about it with people. So that story tells you how important it is to have empathy, but also think about those individual situations. So we've got a few other points that are really important. I could talk about situational empathy for a day, but I will move on. Virtual collaboration is really important because we need to understand what tools help us to collaborate better together and what tools stop us or slow us down from collaborating. And team behaviors is deliberately called team behaviors because it's important to talk about our values, but we also need to understand what behaviors do we see that underpin those values. So for instance, we can all agree that we want respect. And so we could either just leave it at that, put respect on a picture of a cat and all agree that that's one of our values and we're happy and we're done. But for some people, respect would be have your camera on while we're talking to each other so we're engaging, so I can see you. Others would say, well, I've got a lot going on in my background, so I want my camera off so I don't distract you while you're talking. So those are exact opposite behaviors, which are both driven by respect. So it's really important to talk not just about values, but about the behaviors that will underpin those values for this team. Thanks, John. And with our systems of work, this is where we spend time to understand the work. So we might do something like a static workshop to understand the work that's coming in and to understand how it flows through our team and how it produces value at the other end, which is what we're talking about with the visualized work. And sometimes we might not need to do that at all if this team already exists and has already done that work. And that goes for pretty much all of this canvas. It's really good for a brand new team, but it's also really good for a team that's just moved to remote or a team that just wants to have a think about how it's doing things. And it's important to reuse things you've already got and not reinvent the wheel. So there's been teams where we've said, hey, we've got our system of work, we revisit it to test it, and then we say, okay, no, we're actually still pretty happy with that aspect, let's move through. So John, if you hit go ahead a couple of times, you see static, something like that really helps for visualized work. Decision design is really important for most teams, and it's something that most teams don't put the work into thinking about enough. So spend some time talking about, well, what decisions can I make for myself? What decisions should I bring back to the team and centralize? And what decisions do we need to escalate? Making that clear can really help make things happen a lot faster, because depending on the culture of where you are, things will take a heck of a long time to be referred, where no one actually thinks that reference is needed, but everyone's doing it because they think it's expected. And team measures, that's the other thing. I mean, we could talk about different measures of team performance, whether it's flow of value through the system or whatever your measures might be. It's really important to have, you might identify a lot of measures and you might even be able to capture a lot of measures, and that's great. Do that, identify them all, but try to land on 2 or 3 that are important to the team that you can track closely and report on, and that might change over time. So that's your systems of work section. And just as with the first section, you can take as long or as short as is appropriate with the team to work your way through that. And John, I'll move on to the third section, which is our operational cadence. So operational cadence, we need to talk really clearly about, well, how do we communicate with each other and what things do we communicate in which way? Far too often, teams will say, we have emails, so we send emails to each other. Teams might just have a whole lot of Slack channels about whatever they just decide to create, and that might be fine. But it really helps to take the time to say, well, okay, we've got a whole lot of emails flying around. Is that actually the most effective way to work? We don't have the chance for face-to-face. So we can't just kind of, in that traditional office environment, you'll turn around and say, hey, do you understand this? Oh, what's going on with that? And that's kind of replaced by your chat messages, but you're losing fidelity of information with all of these things. Even with a meeting like this, where we're face-to-face, at least somewhat, we're losing some of that depth of communication that we have from being in person. So it really helps to just check in and say, well, how should we be communicating these things? What things should we be communicating as synchronously as possible? Do we actually expect people to check their Slack messages 100 times a day? Do we expect people to respond to emails and read emails really quickly? Do we have a whole lot of information on wikis and so on? It's really just about making sure that we've got that clear, because everyone would have different expectations. And then with remote events, we have a whole pattern that we've developed for designing really good remote events. I'm not going to get into too much of the detail of that now, because as I say, we've got plenty more that I'm going to hand over to. But we think it's really important, and I will hammer this, any event needs to be done with intentionality, with purpose. Just because you were in a Scrum team and you had a stand-up and you had a sprint planning and you had a sprint review, doesn't mean when you change overnight because COVID hit or whenever it might be, and you go to remote, doesn't mean you should have exactly those same meetings in exactly the same way. I'm in a team now with Remote AF. We have a daily stand-up. It's at 12 o'clock and it goes for half an hour. If I was coaching a team that had a stand-up that went for half an hour, I'd step in and say, what's going on, you guys? You need to work it out. These people are supposed to be pretty good at this Agile stuff, and they've got this half-hour meeting in the middle of the day. What's going on? Well, I'll tell you what's going on. It's the only time of the day where they can see each other. It's really not your traditional stand-up meeting. This is that half-hour, let's connect, let's talk to each other. Yes, we talk about the work, but we also take time just to cheer each other up, connect, talk about anything else that's going on. So if you looked at that meeting from the point of view of everyone being in the same place, you'd say, hey, this is a really poor meeting. But if you look at that meeting from the point of view of what its actual purpose is now, which is much more than the traditional purpose of a stand-up, there's this deep purpose of connection. And there's this deep purpose of understanding not just what you're doing at the moment so we can try to hit our sprint goals, but what are we doing more generally? Are we on track strategically and so on, and having the deep conversations about everything that changes from day to day. That's a really great meeting. So you have to think about what is the purpose, and then design meetings around that. The best trick I've seen for doing that, by the way, if you're setting up a team, start with all the purposes that you have that you might need meetings for. So you'd write connect, and you'd write collaborate and work together, and so on and so on and so on. Once you've got that list, then work out, well, do we need meetings for that? And if we do, how should we organize those events? So we've tried to set up a pattern where you can make sure that you start with that purpose, and you can think very carefully about how you prepare and how you run, and the tooling and so on. And that takes us to the end of the canvas. And what you do then is you wind up with a great big, huge amount of data up the top in those three sections that I just took you through. Dave, I think you're going to get there. If you tip your head sideways enough. Then what we do is we try to coalesce that down to something that's really easy to read, to remember, to connect with. And that's what we have down here. So you'll just have a few Post-it notes in each of these sections to talk about, well, what does that mean? How are we as a team? How do we collaborate? What about our communication? What did we take from all of that? And we'll put it together into this remote team agreement. And the last thing I'll mention, and John, I think if you hit go, there's one more animation. Don't reinvent the wheel. I've said that already, but you might already have a team agreement. You don't need to use this exact format. If you don't, this is a great format. I 100% think it helps. But if this team already exists, use the things they've already got. But what we've provided in this tool is something to let you think about everything, to make sure that you cover all of the things that we think are important when it comes to remote work, and come back and revisit it and make sure this isn't unique to remote work at all. Make sure that it's a living, breathing thing. Otherwise, that was a really nice conversation that you had once. And what you want is to have this be a key part of helping the team connect and work really well and become high performing. And with that, that's my spiel. I'll hand over to Dave McKenzie to talk about how do we make remote all hands planning work. And by the way, as I mentioned before, I want to thank everyone for being here and thank you. I'm not here at the end to say that, so I just want to say now, thank you very much. I've appreciated it.
Thanks, James.
Thanks, James.
Sorry, Dave. Hi, everyone. My name's Dave McKenzie, as James introduced. So I'm also from Elaborate, one of the lead consultants based in Melbourne. I wanted to say good morning to you all from my study. It's actually nice in here today. It's quiet. My child's not here. So, yeah, as James mentioned, I'm really here to talk about what we call remote all hands planning. Some of the challenges we face with remote planning at scale that we've found over the last 12 months, and talk through some of the tips and the experiences that I've had running big room planning. I think I've done it 8 or 9 times now across 4 organizations and 3 industries. Some of the tips, some of the tools, some of the experiences I've had from those organizations and those different industries. So, John, if you can please go to the next slide. So I wanted to start with what's big room planning? Well, big room planning or PI planning is planning at scale. Actually, you know what? You're all Agilists, so I'm going to stop there. I'm not going to bore you with a lecture about what big room planning is. You know what it is, right? I'm not going to describe it. Most of you know it. Most of you have been through it. Most of you have probably run it before. So we know big room planning is planning at scale across multiple teams. Potentially they're working on the same product. And we know some of the major characteristics of a big room planning or all hands planning. It's big, it's hard, it's time consuming, there's a lot of prep, it can be hard to organise. How do we find a room? How do we find a space? But we also know that it's really important. We need to align our teams. We need to make sure we've got visibility and transparency on what we're working on. We need to understand and identify dependencies between teams. And big room planning can be a lot of fun. We know this. It's a lot of enjoyment and a lot of entertaining. And sometimes we get pizza and coffee, which is amazing. So no argument there. But what happens when we try to plan at scale in a remote world? So John, thank you. The first thing we do is we panic. We go, oh my God, how are we actually going to do this? Once we settle down from our panic, then we actually freak out because we've got this massive challenge in front of us. Once we start to calm down from that, what we need to do is to start actually thinking about the challenges. So as James just talked about team launch, he got the easy part. One team's easy, maybe 10 people, easy to organize. When you're starting talking about 50, 60, 100, 200 people, organisation and structure becomes really, really, really important and really difficult to do. So there's that first challenge that we need to do is how are we actually going to organise this session? Our people are separated. They're working remotely. So we need to understand how they're going to collaborate, how we're going to help them work together when they're all in their own offices, they're all structured, they're all in their homes. Some people, as James said, have got their kids running in, they need to do school runs. All these things we need to be really aware of, and that situational empathy at scale is really critical to make sure we get a really good result. We know with big room planning or all hands planning that we need to keep alignment and visibility, but again, we're not all in the same room together. So it becomes really hard to just wander around and see how everyone's going. So we need to keep alignment and visibility, but we need to understand how we're going to do that. We've got people, sorry, well, you can jump to that one, sure. We've got people that support many teams. So how do they jump across? We need to understand how that's going to work. How do I collate all the results and the plans at the end? And ultimately, the question is, well, how do we actually plan at scale when people aren't in one room together? So there are a lot of challenges for us to overcome. And John's jumped across to the slide. So from my learning, as I've talked about, there are a couple of easy answers and some tips that we can really use to help us drive forward with these big planning sessions, which we know we have to have. They're incredibly important. And we know we need to run them. We can't wait just because we're remote. So there's some ways for us to go around that. And my first tip is you have to embrace the fact that your people are separated, but they do need to collaborate. So you need a collaboration space where everyone can interact, how they can all work together. But from a remote F perspective, you don't actually have to build this yourself. Our tip is really use an accelerator. It'll cut right down on the time. And what we've got up on the slide here on the screen is what we call the remote AF all hands planning board. Now this is purposely designed for us to actually run all hands planning or big room planning with multiple teams. This example you can see here, 6 teams, to help you run your sessions, plan at scale, and it's ready to roll. We've got dedicated, as I mentioned, dedicated spaces for the teams. There's areas to capture risks and actions, plus all the instructions on what we want the teams to do when they do their breakouts and how they want to manage their work and their workflow is all captured in those spaces. So when a team's working in their area, they don't have to scroll around the board a heap to try and find where they're looking. They can just look at those areas and then they've got the answers to the questions that are there. Now, the base level of this is all locked down, so the spaces are set, but your tips and your goals, obviously with any Miro space or mural space or virtual collaboration tool, you can edit and update, which is super powerful. I've used this board with a telecommunications company. We had about 200 people or 150. James and I actually did that session, running with 6 teams. I've done it, and that was for a program, a delivery program. I've done it with a gaming company as a strategy planning piece across an entire company. And I'm just about to kick off a piece with a people and culture team, a single team, 1 project. I'm really looking forward to that, actually. It's the smallest big room planning I'll ever, all hands planning I'll ever be in. And the same sort of idea. So the tool scales and the board scales and to what you need it for, and you can edit and change and move and facilitate it the way you like. Tip 2 for remote all hands planning or planning at scale in a remote world is you have to have an agenda, makes sense, and you have to stick to it. One of the things we know, remote meetings tend to lose time here and there. We're waiting for people to log in. We're waiting for people to come back into the large group if we're using breakout rooms. We're waiting 30 seconds because someone's talking and we've asked them a question, but they've forgot to come off mute. All of these things become really important and really time consuming when we're running a remote setting, a session. So you really, when you're facilitating an all hands planning and big room planning session, you need to be super ruthless about the time and the agenda. You need to stick to the time. You need to include the details of what the teams need to do in a space that's easy to find, so you don't have to, they're not asking constant questions all the time. To stick to an agenda, you need to be super prepared. You need to be prepared to plan. You have to have everything set up first. You need to know and plan on how you're going to run the session. So that's normal. We all know we need to do that, but you actually need to ramp it up. So what's going to be done where? How am I going to use breakout rooms if we're using Zoom like we are today? Who's in each room? Who are you going to allocate to each room? One of the tips is set the rooms up before the session. Know where people are going to go before the session, so you don't actually have to worry about it. Know where you can allocate people if they support multiple teams. One of the things that's really obvious in a single room when we're all together is if I've got a person that supports 2 teams, maybe a solution architect, they actually jump and walk between the teams. It's really actually pretty easy for them. Well, in a remote setting, you can't really do that. So you need to be really purposeful about who's going to what team at what time. So really understand and kind of like build a roster and a schedule for that key people as they move around the different teams, and let the teams know that for the first half hour of your breakout, you will have your solution architect, but the second half hour, they need to go support another team. So you need to be really planned around that. Or even better than that, if you want to go to the next level, is give people the ability to move around themselves. It'll save a lot of time and effort. But my number 1 tip with this, and James and Farnaz both know this because I've thrown them in the deep end and asked them to do this for me, is just have someone else organize that for you. Have someone else support you in the session, in the Zoom call. Let them do the techie things so you can actually concentrate on just facilitating the session and actually talking through and making sure we stick to the agenda and we help the team move through their planning. So that's my tip for that. My 3rd tip is around alignment and visibility. So the really good news about remote working and remote collaboration is a virtual collaboration space actually makes the work the teams are doing really easy to see, which helps with visibility and transparency. So we're in a single room. You've literally got to walk around the whole room and look at all the different boards and sort of understand. In a virtual collaboration space, all you do is zoom out and you can actually see 100 or 200 or 300 people all working in their spaces. Really easy to zoom in and out, see questions asked and all that. So you can actually find out what's going on. So visibility becomes super powerful, which ramps up your transparency, obviously. But my call out would be that you really need to also ramp up the alignment, because we lose the ability just to walk around and listen in. So in your agenda, when you're doing your all hands planning playbacks and the teams have done their thing, their playback, or they've done their planning, they want to do their plan back, really design into your agenda to make sure they're doing that often and early. I always have a minimum of 2 in any planning session, and always after any team breakout. So always bring people back so they're actually telling us exactly what they're doing. Another thing which becomes critical in really large programs is having the teams understand and capture dependencies between the work. So it's a bit hard to see on the board here, but underneath the team space, there's a few green boxes which indicate the other teams. And what we really do in the example I'll show you is actually point out where they've got work that's dependent on other teams. So you can really ramp up that visibility of the dependencies, and you can facilitate the teams to actually work together to align those ones as well. And my final one, which I love about the virtual tools, is collation at the end of your planning session. It's actually really easy because you just copy and paste it, which is fantastic. So John, move on to the next slide, please. So here's an example of all hands planning and a team space and a full board. So on the left here, you can actually see the team's place where the teams plan their work. In this instance, they did a 12-month rolling roadmap, so not really your traditional three-month PI planning horizon. But we can actually see where they've taken all their work and they've planned it in sequence, but those vertical lines are those dependencies. They're actually starting to call out the ability to say, well, I need work from other teams. And what's cool here is if you can really see this in a lot of detail, those lines themselves are green or they're red. So a red line indicated for these guys that they'd had a conversation with the other team, but they weren't able to, at the time during planning, to align the dependencies. So they were around the wrong order. A green one indicated they'd had the conversation. They're actually able to align the dependencies. So they knew the work they needed to do was going to get done before the other team had work that they needed. So in this instance, what we really did for this program is they were really keen to understand an interconnection. It was a massively interconnected program of work across multiple teams. So we actually planned in on how people were going to do that. And we actually planned in key people who would move through the breakouts into different teams so they could actually have these important conversations. So we let them move through the breakout rooms. And over on the right, we're kind of zoomed out a little bit of the whole board, but you can see 3 teams. It's kind of in the middle of here, their spaces, but then you can see how we've actually collated it all together. What I really liked about this board is it's the same size, the team space and the program space. So I literally just copy and paste it in the middle, but it's awesome. So you can actually get a collated view of the entire program as a whole, understand where each of the different features will be completed, plus all the actions and the issues in one place. So it's super beneficial to understand how that's going to work. So from a remote setting, and one of the things we find super beneficial about our remote all hands planning is planning is and can be more collaborative, and alignment's better because we're actually showing what we're doing in real time to anyone at any point, because all you need to do is zoom out and you can actually see it. That visibility is actually massive. So we can actually see how everything plugs together with a simple scroll of your mouse. You just zoom out and see it all, and it's fantastic. I've actually got a video. I can't show it because it's all client labeled with client names and some sensitive information. But it's a really cool, interesting thing where you've got hundreds of little mouses moving around, little pointers moving around as people do all their work, which is fantastic. As I mentioned, collation's super simple, super easy, because all you just do is copy and paste it into the area that you want, move things really easily, have some really excellent conversations. And my favorite part is at the end of any planning session, especially if you're in the office, at some point you're going to have to digitize it. You're going to have to put it in the tools that you want. Well, the cool thing about a virtual collaboration board is it's actually digitized already for you. You've already got a digital version of your plan that's already visual. There's no need to do a lot of rework to out of the session to do it, because it's already in a collaboration space that you can live and learn. It's alive. You can continually get your teams to come back to their plan. You can use the center program as your Scrum of Scrum space if you're running a Scrum of Scrums meeting. So that's all super powerful and super useful for us. John, that's me. I'm going to hand over to Farnaz, who's going to talk about op model design.
Thank you very much, Dave. It's always nice to hear about your stories and your experience about planning. So, hi everyone, my name is Farnaz Vahab, one of RAF co-authors and a principal consultant from Elaborate based in lovely Melbourne. As the last topic of today's meetup, I want to talk about the remote AF operation model design very briefly and share with you how it has helped a program of work resolve problems and challenges they had with their teaming model. John, would you please move to the next slide, please? Thank you. In this slide, you can see the remote AF operating model canvas. And this canvas is like a thinking tool, provides a structured process for guiding teams and leadership groups to define how teams should organize and adjust their operating model to their context and be able to design a remote or hybrid friendly operating model. This canvas, as you see, consists of a series of activities and steps. We believe in order to design an effective operating model for a system, we need to constantly review the way the operating model is set. We ensure it is set up to align with their strategy, with their customer, with supply chain constraints, and any other unique constraint that exists in that environment. Through this canvas, we go through that process and engage people in that system of work to prototype and co-design their teaming models and team interactions. The main purpose of this RAF operating model design is to move organization to the idea that operating model design can be done in cadence, can be done in small changes rather than big bang transformation, and it should be done openly and transparently with members of that system so we can maintain trust in that organization and system over time. There are two key attributes, very specific attributes about this RAF operating model design. One is its scalability aspect. We can use it for designing teams operating model to organization operating model, designing organization operating model. And the other aspect is that the way it considers and values the remote perspective in the design process. John, would you please move to the next slide? Thank you. And here I want to share with you an example where I use this canvas for operating model design. We did it for a high profile program of work, around 50 people in a financial institution, working with multiple vendors across 3 different time zones with line of sight to the organization board. We got engaged during pandemic last year to facilitate a new operating model for that program. It needed to be co-designed and championed by the organization and vendors that were involved in that program, and it specifically needed to be effective in a remote setup. In our early conversation with that group, they shared different types of problems with us, such as working relationship in this program were broken, affecting teams, vendors, and delivery of the work. They were dealing with key person risk. They had high failure demands in the different part of software development cycle, and they were experiencing a lengthy lead time. They had poor flow of information and were working in silos. They had significant amount of work to complete, but they knew that there was little chance of success without changing their teaming model. Then when we got involved, we knew that we couldn't just lift and shift the existing operating model. We needed to purposefully design it for that system of work to be effective and sustainable in long term. When we started this engagement, first we focused on understanding their system of work and validating our assumptions before getting involved in changing their teaming model. We ran a series of interviews, worked with a group of people representing different roles involved in that program to understand their landscape, their context, their organization strategy, their program goals. and we learned about how who their customers are and through what products and services they provide value to those customers. Then, with the help of RAF operating model design canvas, we look at different areas of constraint. We look at their system of work, their supply chains, their capacity to deliver, and how as a collective they were interacting with each other. We look at the locations and time zones their teams were running, and we assess different platforms, tools, and technologies they were adopting, and assess the way they were constrained by the operating model. After evaluating our assumptions and understanding the main pain points, we work with the leadership team to set up some design principle and design constraint, setting some guardrails for our design process. And then when it came to the actual design process, we got engaged all members of that program in a series of workshops, of course in a remote setup, and co-design the operating model together. We split them into multiple groups, ran multiple design sprints in parallel. For each design sprint, they all had one specific goal. They consumed all of our finding, the design principle and constraint. They used the RAF template to prototype and design the operating model. At the end of each sprint, they showcased their operating model to each other, collected feedback, and continued with refining and redesigning their model. We went through 4 design sprints in total. And in the end, we landed on a new operating model that could address the main concerns and issues. And more importantly, they had the full team commitment and leadership support to implement the new operating model for that program of work. Honestly, they couldn't believe that they could get that level of engagement and collaboration in a remote setup. And they were quite satisfied with how engaged their teams and peoples were in designing their teaming model and designing their op model. And they were very, very excited about how their collective knowledge and expertise utilized in this co-creation. That was my story to share with you, quick and short. Thank you very much for listening, and happy to answer any question if you still have time.
Yeah, actually, so I just noticed we've run over time a little bit. So what we might do actually, just to respect everyone's time, I'm sure for the folks in AU, you've probably got your first meetings or some work that needs to kick off in a few minutes. So feel free to reach out to us via the meetup group, and we'll answer any questions in there just to sort of keep everything up to date. Outside of that, I just feel it's good to share that David, James, and Farnaz are all fairly exceptional folk who are usually herding these kinds of cats in a physical space, but it's interesting that they were able to still not only help organizations with problems that they'd have anyway prior to a remote working setting, but they're actually able to get above average outcomes for those organizations in a remote setting, which is honestly quite impressive from my view.